Welcome to the 50th anniversary of a famous event at the University of Notre Dame that took place on November 18th, 1969. Today is November 18th, 2019. The event was that 10 students protested the presence of DOW and the CIA coming to campus to recruit in that year, and that the university set the recruiting offices next to each other in the main building. And the students had asked that according to what were the regulations at the time, that DOW and CIA appear before the student body to explain what they were doing. Now, DOW CIA were major symbols in terms of the anti-Vietnam War movement because of the incredible the incredible pain and suffering both organizations were bringing to the people of Vietnam, clandestinely and overtly. Well, anyway, DOW and the CIA people had often across the country explained what they were doing to students. In this particular case, the student body had signed the petition asking for that discussion with them in accordance with the rules of the university. But the university refused to allow them to speak, and hence the demonstration occurred outside of the offices where they were recruiting in the main building. Prior to this, Ted Hesburgh, the president of the university at that time, had given an ultimatum in the spring of that year that anyone who disrupted the activities of the university, interfered with free speech, would be given 15 minutes to cease and desist, and then they would be expelled. Well, what took place was the dean of students, a Holy Cross priest by the name of Jim Reilly, came and told the fellas they had about 15 minutes to get out of there, or else he was going to start collecting student ID cards. And 15 minutes passed, and they stayed, wanting the discussion with the DOW CIA people and in front of the doors of the two recruiting spots. Well, anyway, Jim Reilly came back and then took, kind of arbitrarily, student identification cards from people, and 10 of them, and these students became the Notre Dame 10. And over a period of several weeks, there were several trials on the university level, and eventually, after all the trials, there came the same verdict. The students should be understood to be guilty, and that what eventually took place is that left to the final adjudication of the president of the university, he said that they should be suspended or expelled, depending what students we're talking about. And so that took place 50 years ago today. And so we have here a panel of people who were involved in that, 3 of the students themselves, along with Professor Carl Estabrook and myself, who taught here at the time, who were deeply involved in helping the students prior to that event and after that event. And so now I'll just let each one of them introduce themselves here on the panel.
Well, I'm Mark Mahoney, and I'm an attorney in Buffalo, New York, but I don't know that you introduced yourself. Charles McCarthy, Reverend Emmanuel Charles McCarthy, and was at that time Professor Charles McCarthy at Notre Dame. And to my left,
I'm John Eckenrode. I'm a retired professor of human development at Cornell University. I live in Ithaca, New York.
I'm Carl Estabrook. I'm a retired professor at the University of Illinois. I had just been appointed member of the history department, a faculty member at the University of Notre Dame when this event occurred, and I left Notre Dame a year later, not by choice.
I'm Chris Cotter. I'm a physical therapist from Urbana, Ohio. I was one of the students who was initially expelled and then commuted to suspensions.
all right, so where do we go from there? What was it about? I mean, for a lot of us, or for some of us, I would say we certainly weren't looking for a fight that day. There had been students that met days before. They had this, was said there had been a petition signed by the Student Senate and also by the Faculty Senate, which requested that recruiters have to speak with us before engaging their recruiting activities, which was really an academic freedom issue. And that was not what was done in other campuses around the country, where the whole mission was to keep recruiters from coming onto the campus at all. But we had a different approach here at Notre Dame. We thought, well, let them come and see if students were interested in working there, but have them also agree to discuss what kind of activities they were engaged in. There's quite a lot of research that had been done around this about the activities of the CIA, the impact of Dow Chemical, the millions of gallons of napalm that had been dropped in Vietnam, which was knowingly going to hurt Vietnam civilians, and of course ended up hurting troops, of course, but in that country there was no way to tell the difference, and so villages were napalmed, and it was a brutal weapon. Dow also was making Agent Orange, and in our materials about this event we talked about the herbicides that were being dropped, specific chemicals that Dow Chemical had come up with for herbicidal stuff, and we knew it was damaging, but at that time I think we, like everybody else, didn't know how damaging it was. So there was a lot of thinking that went ahead of this, and we talked on the day before. There was a meeting where students talked about what would we do if they don't agree to talk to us, and I would say there wasn't a really clear answer. So I went to see what happened, and I wasn't. We were confronted with a situation. I decided I'm not going to leave. This is wrong, and it's wrong as a position of the university, not drawing a big divide between its mission as a Catholic university and a university community, and its protection and insulation of its whole stance with respect to companies like Dow and agencies like the CIA. So, I stuck it out, and that's how I got here. John, your story was somewhat similar in a way.
Well, it was. I was not one of the leaders. I mean, it wasn't a protest that had very clearly defined leaders. There were some people more involved than others. There's some people that it's important to point out. This was the third year, actually, of this recruitment scenario of Dow and CIA being in the administration building scheduled on the same day, and it was the third year of student protest against it. The year before, in '68, there was a 3-day vigil in the administration building by students who stayed in the administration building. They didn't block access to doorways like some of us ended up doing in '69, but they were clearly upset with the university. The university knew this was a controversial position that they took, and a controversial action to schedule these in the administration building at the same time. Father Reilly was present in the '68 vigil as well. There was an article in the New York Times the next day on November 19th, 1968 that talked about 100 students at a vigil at Notre Dame. Father Reilly actually had some fairly benign and complimentary things to say about the protesters in '68. And that all changed after the 15-minute rule letter that came out in the spring of '69. And I think there was a heightened anxiety on the part of university administrators, given what was going on in the country. I think there was a push. There was some alums, I think, that were not happy with how the university dealt with the protesters from 1968. They thought there should have been a harsher response of the university to those students. One student that I remember did get suspended for 10 days. Marty McNamara, I think, got suspended in '68. So the atmosphere changed. There was a push nationally and from the alums, and I think when Father Hesburgh came out with his letter, he got a lot of compliments from people like Spiro Agnew and others who commended him for taking a tough stand on student protesters at Notre Dame. So I think in some sense, even though what we did wasn't radically different from what happened in '68, I mean, that involved 100 students taking over the building, sitting in for 3 days in the administration building, well beyond parietal hours, so to speak, and which we're talking about this week on campus, I think. And the police were not called out in '68. There was no 15-minute rule ultimatums in '68, but the situation had changed, and I think a good case can be made that we were seen as sort of a test case of the 15-minute rule. We were the first, and I imagine the last use of that, formal use of the Hesburgh 15-minute rule. I'm sure there's other rules and regulations now in place that maybe mimic those. So I think, as Mark said, we didn't go with the idea of destroying things or occupying a building and so forth. The symbolic blocking of the doors, I think, was a relatively, I won't say minor, but a relatively small act compared to what was going on at other universities at the time. There was no burning down of the ROTC building and any of those kinds of things that were happening elsewhere. So I think that's part of the context. I think it was used as an example to tamp down further protests, which obviously didn't happen because in the spring of 1970, Notre Dame joined many other universities in the strike of spring of 1970. So I'm not sure how successful that was as a strategy on the part of the university, but I think it's good to put it in some larger context here.
I think it's a very good point.
It seems so provocative, though, when you think back on it, with the 3 prior years, that they were angling for, some way to bring the rule down on the heads of students. It was really entrapment in a certain way, speaking as an attorney, as I tend to do.
It was a setup.
I think
That's
so.
my judgment.
I think so, and I think that needs to be underlined because the situation in the country as a whole wasn't quite what we have in our official memory of those days. By the time this event took place, polls showed that 70% of Americans not only disapproved of the Vietnam War, but thought it was a crime, not a mistake. And that was important. Friends of the administration, and the president of the University of Notre Dame was a friend of the administration, were dealing with a situation of public dismay, at the least, of what the government was doing. And the notion of a setup that would criminalize, in some sense, student protest was not far from their thoughts. Everyone realized that the opposition to the war had begun on campuses and had spread beyond that to the business community and the political community as well, and that it was winning.
A lot of returning veterans were the backbone of that movement in a lot of ways.
We have to remember that the reason the U.S. withdrew from Vietnam was primarily, of course, it was the resistance of the Vietnamese people to being colonized, but the primary reason at home was the revolt of the army of draftees that the U.S. had sent to South Vietnam. The Pentagon and the administration were dealing with the fact that they couldn't rely on members of the forces that the U.S. sent there, not even to shoot their officers. It had got that bad. And they needed, in the country as a whole, something that would try to reinforce the position of the administration by denigrating the opinion of those who objected to the war. And students, since the opposition to the war had begun on campus, students were a good place to start.
It was when you look at inviting DOW and CIA it's hard for people who weren't around 50 years ago as adults to realize what kind of symbols these were. These were the symbols of the war, not just the war, of atrocities, of everything bad about life and bad about the military. They were maximal symbols of anti-war. Now, to bring them both onto campus on the same day, next to each other in 2 rooms at the same place,
And insist upon it.
and insist upon it 3 years in a row, something doesn't ring true there. Something doesn't ring true. And I would just suggest that what doesn't ring true is the fact that the people, in that case they're mostly priests, but some lay people, the people that run the university, by necessity have to be street smart, have to be politically smart. What politically smart administrator of a university brings DOW and CIA in a second and a third year after such trouble was caused each year before? And so by doing this, putting the 15-minute rule in place 6 months earlier, doing this again, not allowing the DOW and CIA to talk, which is common, creating the situation by breaking their own rules of not allowing them to talk, I would suspect that it not only ingratiated the university's administration and leadership to the military, it ingratiated it to corporate America. Recently, retired President Dow gave Notre Dame $10 million. The problem with this is, and I don't want to, I'll talk on this later. The problem with this is Dow and CIA represented the extremes of creating unnecessary human misery in the world, the extremes of human suffering over in Southeast Asia. And the university basically was aiding and abetting that, not only in this, but in the way it sent ROTC students, a continuing flow of ROTC students over to Vietnam to do this killing, this maiming, this causing of suffering. No, this was not an accident. But one thing it did do, as Carl mentioned, it catalyzed more than the Notre Dame community in favor of being against student protest. Spiro Agnew, Vice President of the United States, and so forth and so on. New York Times, they were all filled with how Ted Hesburgh stood up against the students in the 15-minute rule. Oh no, it served a purpose for the university politically and financially, but it served no purpose in terms of the suffering people of Vietnam.
It was no accident the president of Notre Dame had a friend and the president in the White House.
That's right. What we're trying to deal with here is this is a major corporate organization. It is not run by people who are fools. They know how to judge matters. And the fact that they put this right there 6 months after the 15-minute rule was initiated, they were setting up the students, setting them up for something. And added to that, the fact that they would not allow Dow and CIA to do what they did on every other campus in the United States, talk to the students, was to precipitate the conflict, to set it up so that, to make a name in terms of the military and corporate America that thrives in so many ways off of causing suffering to other people.
We had
Chris,
also heard.
Chris,
we had
how did you
also-
get involved? Tell us the story.
Let me
Yeah.
say, we had also heard that Dow and the CIA offered to meet off campus
did.
to avoid this.
They did, yeah.
And the university said no.
No, that's right. That's absolutely right. And this
So
is
that-
atrocious.
that-
This is,
that-
yeah.
That reinforces exactly what you said.
Yeah.
It was a setup. You know.
Chris, how'd you get What was your backstory on this? I mean, John was a product of Catholic education. I was raised Catholic. How'd you? And
I was
we
raised
came to Notre
Catholic.
Dame. We never learned about violence and nonviolence in our Catholic upbringing.
We learned about violence.
Yeah. Nothing about just war. Nothing about, nothing about concerns about Christ's teachings and the military. How'd you come into this?
I think it started when I had a course coming back from Innsbruck from Father Maury Amon, and it was Christian ethics. And in the midst of, part of the course was reading Tolstoy, and Tolstoy definitely teaches gospel nonviolence, and so that changed my perspective, and it made the opinion about Vietnam very easy to take then. And so then I was gone for a semester. I came back, and all of a sudden there's this nonviolence program here. The war is escalating, and I got involved in that. And we had just come back from the 2-day moratorium in Washington, D.C., where we arrested in the Pentagon for attempting to hold a religious service in the Pentagon. And so we came back on Sunday, I think the 19th was a Tuesday that year. And I was at that meeting in Newland Science Hall that night. Everybody's arguing what we're going to do, what are we going to do? And I'd already decided what I was going to do. I just said, well, you can talk some more. I know what I'm going to do. So I was clear at that point that I was going to block the doors. And I knew I was going to do that. So I looked like my father thought I just happened by because I had my books in my hand. I just happened by, I got sucked into it. That's not what happened. I went with the intent to do that. Now, whether or not I was going to, the part of the rule was that you had 15 minutes to cease and desist. If you turned in your ID cards, you would be suspended. If you continued, you had another 5 minutes. And then, if you didn't then, you would be automatically expelled. So I was standing, Ed Royko was on my left. I didn't know what I was going to do at 15 minutes, I said, Ed, what are you going to do? He said, well, I'm not going to get suspended. I'm not going to get expelled. So that sounds good to me. So we turned our ID cards in 15 minutes. I still got expelled. So, but it was a lot of it was the product of the nonviolence program.
The program that Charlie ran.
Yeah.
I was quite surprised that they. I got that night. I got a suspension letter. I was quite surprised. I just didn't think that they would use the hammer in that way. And he might call us in and say, "Don't do that again" or whatever. But I think I underestimated exactly the plan that was evidently there to make examples of us. And of course, in a school like Notre Dame then, and I think also today, they probably figured you only have to punish a handful of students to make the others so intimidated that they won't do anything. Especially these days, students have so much at stake in their and they're under such pressure. These are the top students in the country, and they've got so much at stake in this that the administration has an easy time of intimidating them. And so just to pick out a few scapegoats like we were and punish them is a way to intimidate everybody else. And I think that there was discussion about another demonstration the following day in the administration building. I don't remember whether that ever happened or not.
But really, Mark, the fact of the matter is, you only have to crucify one to make the others fear.
That certainly was the theory.
Mm-hmm.
And it had its impact on all of us. I mean, I don't hear too many gripes about it, except a great Father Hesburgh played down the significance of this in his book. He wrote about this on more than one occasion, and each time he suggested that, boys will be boys, no harm, no foul. Everybody graduated, came back, and everybody graduated, and I think even hinting they graduated on time. And of course, this wasn't true. 2 of the students never returned. Some I know, one returned, and then there were a lot of things going on, but there's a lot of. I'm sure a lot of it relates to having gone through this whole suspension process, losing a semester of grades, and some I think we just haven't been in contact with since then, which is deeply saddening at that time.
And we've tried to contact them.
Yeah,
We can't find
and
them.
they're so disaffected because of this. That's true pain.
Yeah,
That's true harm. And it's not just harm to them, as Charlie pointed out today in the administration building. It's harm to their family and their loved ones and their future. And to me, it's you begin to see this at so many levels. I've seen it with high school suspensions and even grade school suspensions, and these administrators of schools who toe these hard lines, and they're not really thinking about how it affects the people involved. That's, of course, a very unchristian approach to it by supposedly Christian university, but it's like, it just was so automatic and so thoughtless. How easy it would have been to say, let's, all right, maybe we should talk about this. But there was too much to protect, too much to hide.
Just a footnote on that score. There was the process. We had a choice at the end of the when we got the letter from Father Reilly. There's, as part of this process, there was an appeals process made available to us, and it was basically a two-pronged. There was like a fork in the road. You could either go the legal route. You could basically do a trial where there'd be evidence given and
Prove that I blocked the doorway.
prove that we blocked the doorway, and we would say, well, we didn't really block the doorway. We all admitted we blocked the doorway, and we did it willingly. So it was kind of made little sense for us to go the legal route and hire lawyers and come in with their three-piece suits on and defend us.
Civil court was ruled out explicitly.
Civil court was ruled out. So it was going to be a criminal affair, whether we were guilty or not. So that made no sense. The other route was to submit ourselves basically to a three-person appeals panel, which was ultimately the arbiter of the end of this process of discussions and meetings and so forth. And that's where we presented the written defense that Father McCarthy, Charlie, and Carl worked on, and then we edited and put in our 2 cents. It was a very quick process, so we weren't that equipped as students to pull together a defense document that quickly, so we did have some very important help from faculty. So that's the route we went. Now, if you see the letter, and this is part of the archival material, there is a letter that the appeals, we went to this appeals hearing. It was, as I remember, it was a fairly well-attended hearing. There was a lot of people there. We wanted to present our defense as it was written. The other side, the university, did bring their lawyers in with three-piece suits and law books, and they plopped them on the table. And it was clear they were ready to argue the legal case, so that we were in fact guilty of as charged, and we did violate the rules, and so off you go. But part of the archival material is the actual appeals board. The appeals board then adjourned at the end of this. It wasn't a very long hearing, as I remember it. Then the three-person appeals board had to go and deliberate and write a letter of recommendations back to the university, to Father Reilly, essentially to Father Hesburgh. And their recommendation was actually a very measured one. They basically argued in the end recommendation, as far as our punishment was concerned, is that all the punishments, they were expulsions and suspensions at that point, all of them be reduced, and that they urged the university to consider, or really you're urging Father Hesburgh to consider, an act of executive, and they use the word executive clemency, and where you would reduce all of them to basically non-suspensions, and that the university use this opportunity to create a dialogue around these issues. So there was a second part to this, which is this as an institution and as a community, use this opportunity to strike a dialogue and have this conversation, and this is a spark for that conversation. Ultimately, that recommendation of the appeals board was rejected. The expulsions were reduced to suspensions. The suspensions were left as suspensions, and hence you had 10 suspended students. There was no executive clemency, and there was no dialogue that the university sponsored around these issues and so forth. So I just wanted to make sure I got that history straight.
I should mention, John, also that this is my feeling, and this is during this whole time after the demonstrations, and with the appeals and with the right and so forth and so on, there was a great deal of serious interest among faculty and students with what was going on, because it began to take on its own life for that little 1 month period. And the university was a little concerned about what was major concern, maybe for all I know, about what would happen if this whole thing began to snowball and people began to really become discontent with what was taking place here. And Phil Facenda, who was the assistant to the president, senior assistant to Ted Hesburgh, an attorney, a Chicago attorney, came to me and he said, "What's going on, Charlie?" I said, "No, there's no problem with violence. There's no problem with it. It's not going to happen that way." And he said to me, these are his words. These were Phil Facenda's words to me. He said, "Don't worry. Father Ted will take care of all this in the end." He deceived me. He deceived me in order to get me to somehow be part of placating people, to calm them down, to do something.
Which you really didn't do.
I didn't do anything. But what he did was he said, Father, it was absolutely clear what he meant. Huh? That yeah, something very, very modified would be done, and Father Ted will take care of all of this in the end. Don't worry, Father Ted will take care of all this.
He did.
He was channeling Rudy Giuliani in advance.
He did. Father Ted took care of it. He suspended everyone. That's not what Phil meant when he told me that. So I was had on that point by Phil Facenda.
One thing I think when you look back on the succession of events, there were a succession of moral appeals to the university and Christian appeals to the university. Number one, before the whole protest, they provocatively set it up to have the recruitment by these two organizations again on the same day. And the Student Senate and Faculty Senate responded and filed their petitions asking for this open question and answer forum with these organizations, and the university rebuffs that. Then when we were put to the choice of whether to stick with the old disciplinary system, which had this 3-person appeals panel, or the new system, which was somewhat more legalistic, and we met with the assistant dean of the law school, who was a gentleman named Les Fascio, who later I appeared in front of many times he was a magistrate judge, a U.S. magistrate judge in Buffalo. And we rejected that. We said we don't want to argue the points. What we want to do is put this back to Father Hesburgh, back to Father Really, as a moral question. What's the right thing to do here? What's the thing to do in the spirit of academic university? What's the spirit
Christian university
in a Christian community? And then the appeals board did exactly the same thing we did. They went back and saying, look, yes, they violated the rules, but the punishment that was proposed doesn't fit the crime, which is really a moral argument. It's a fairness argument, and it was a Christian argument they made. They talked about how we had challenged the community and that should be taken to heart. And that was rejected. And then later by Father Really initially, and then later I went and talked to Father Hesburgh, who I actually knew quite well. And he clearly, we didn't matter. We were not the important ones. This is what Will Studding also said he wrote an article at the time. Famous teacher in the program of liberal studies, a revered teacher, talked about how the we in the university was the university, the military, the corporations, the board of trustees who were with major corporations, and the they was us, the students. When it came to looking at the internal operation of the university, its policy, its investments, its what it was complicit with in the corporations who they were training students for, or the military who they were training for. We were the they, and so, and at that level too, really the university put a brick wall to any of these moral or Christian kind of pleas.
There's probably a point that should be mentioned here in terms of Mark mentioned earlier that Ted Hesburgh, in his autobiography, God, Country, and Notre Dame, he does not give an accurate presentation of the events. He gives a partial presentation, in some cases a misleading, half-truth presentation, in some cases just wrong. Winston Churchill once said, history is going to be kind to me because I'm going to write it. The victors always write history. I noticed in the Observer that came out last week, the person or persons writing the editorial article on what was coming up today mentioned that, like so much at Notre Dame, the Dow CIA event is hazy and passes into legend. There is nothing hazy about this event. Nothing. The documentation from the time is there on all fronts. Ted Hesburgh could have had access to it since it's in the archives if he wanted it. But what he did and what people in power do is they obfuscate. They confuse things. And everything does become hazy. You know? And maybe there wasn't a Gulf of Tonkin incident. Maybe you can kill 2 million people over an incident. Well, could have been, you know, that sort of business. Huh? Therefore, what I'm saying here is that there's nothing. Just to be clear, there is nothing hazy about this event. It's detailed in the extreme in the newspapers at Notre Dame, the magazines, the writings, and so forth at the time. Something happened, the reason it happened, and something was done, the context, everything is there. And it's there for anyone who's an alumnus today or a student today to look at the record and say, who did the Christian thing? Who followed Jesus? The priest in the administration, Ted Hesburgh, Jim Reilly, or the students? Who was doing what this university was created for? And following the mandate and mission of this university. It's not hazy.
What, you know, for some of us, I mean, I don't know, the ones who were involved, we know that many were disaffected, very sadly, and were hurt by this. You know, I don't know whether it's important, whether it really matters what personal stories we have about, you know, what happened to us afterward. And I think it changed, I think the ways it changed my life. I'm not griping about it. But I don't know whether we have any stories to tell in that regard.
The fact that the fellas who have disassociated themselves from what we're doing, both at the 40th anniversary and here, it says to me that there's serious hurt. There's hurt. And either they don't want to go back to it, or they're so infuriated, or whatever the case may be. But not even to respond to emails. There's hurt, and by the way, it's you that mentioned to me, Mark, because I didn't know this. You said that the university immediately notified the draft board that you who were protesting the war, against the war, anti-war people, were now no longer in the university and therefore were now eligible for the draft. That's just diabolical. That's just diabolical. Not sick, diabolical. You don't do that. The people who are protesting the war that you kick out, and now you tell us their local draft boards that they're now eligible to go to the draft. It's all wrong.
All that occurred within 1 month. 1 month.
1 month.
Too,
1
because
month. Bang, bang,
most of us
bang.
applied for readmission and got back in. So there was that 1 month where we were not members of the university.
That's right. They got bang, bang, bang.
Yeah.
It's almost as if it were orchestrated.
And it's not as though there's a high likelihood that for the people in this group as well, that it just wasn't a question of, well, maybe they'd be drafted before they're graduated from college and no longer had a deferment, although, you know, that was one thing. But these were individuals who were likely to resist the draft and therefore end up in prison or fleeing to Canada. So the consequences would have been even greater for this particular class of individuals. And I frankly don't know how the ones who didn't come back, you know, I don't know what happened. We do have friends that went to prison for resisting the draft. And so, you know, it was at best thoughtless bureaucracy, but at worst, a deliberate jab by somebody to deeply punish those who have been suspended.
Is it possible to talk about, just for a minute, to talk about the fact that this event had consequences on the university? In my own judgment, there was a moment, just to use an analogy, there was a moment back in 1981 when the air traffic controllers struck. And what took place was Ronald Reagan used the military as scabs to break the strike, crossing the picket lines, and used the Teamsters who were supporting him as scabs to cross the picket lines. Once the military was used as scabs in the setting in, that started the destruction of the unions in the United States. And since then, the legislation, everything, it's almost impossible to unionize. As a matter of fact, right at the time this was happening, one of our friends, Tim McCary, was arrested because he was trying to help the laborers at Notre Dame unionize. Right at this very time, he was arrested. But be that as it may, once that 1981 decision was made to use the military to be scabs, and the subsequent legislation that followed that, the destruction of unions in the United States was well on its way. In 1981, 34% of the working force was unionized. Today, it's 11%. Same also with Notre Dame. This was, if I can use an example, this was the fork in the road. You could have either looked at what you were founded on, that is the person and the teachings and the reality of God who becomes human in Jesus, and look to what he teaches, and stand up in the face of clear discrepancy between that and what DOW and CIA represented. Or you could go with DOW CIA and all that represented in terms of political power, wealth, money, etc., etc. It was a fork in the road. Could have gone two ways, as the Robert Frost poem says. It chose. And today, just before I came out here, I looked at Wikipedia under Notre Dame and so on and so on. There's a question in Wikipedia. Is Notre Dame a military school? Notre Dame has the largest ROTC contingent in the country as far as Catholic schools. It's military from one end to the other, militarized. And one of the things that is forgotten and not talked about is this was DOW CIA. By 1969, everyone knew what DOW was doing, but everyone knew what the CIA was about too in Vietnam and other places. The CIA was about all kinds of black ops operations all over the Southeast Asia, and had been for 20 years prior to that, causing the Vietnam War. That became clear after Hesburgh report came out. But the CIA has been involved with Notre Dame deeply since its founding, since it became CIA rather than OSS. There have been members of the Board of Trustees who are CIA members. The student body president of Notre Dame was used as a CIA operative knowingly and still admits it, and others. It's more and more. It was not just a protest against DOW. It was a protest against a black ops operation that is radically inconsistent with the gospel and the teaching of the church. Nothing was said. It's just, you're like recruiting. If you're recruiting for CIA, you're recruiting for McDonald's. No. Ted Hesburgh, Jim Reilly, all those people, or at least the priest, they know better than that. They knew better than that.
Well, and another way to look at this, sometimes we look at, you could look at this as a black box and look at the outcomes. Speaking of the fork in the road, we look at Notre Dame today and its physical plant. We look at the At the time when we were students, Father Hesburgh started the Summa fundraising program. They sought to raise like $35 million or something. The endowment at that time was relatively small compared to other universities. Then it became another program for $75 million. And then later it became $1 billion that Father Hesburgh, the plan was to make it for $750 million. And he just came out at the time of the event, somewhere around the time, and said, why don't we make it $1 billion? Would we have this physical plant today? Would we have all these things that, when you think of all of the energy that university devoted to fundraising to create this physical plant that we have today, and that we see, which is this university has certainly doubled or tripled in size in terms of its physical plant. Is that possible if the other fork had been taken? If the university had sat down and said, maybe you're right, maybe we should look at our investments, maybe we should look at who we have recruited, the conditions under which we recruit. Maybe we should look at the having 3 military programs and only 1 very small nonviolence program, which ultimately was not fully supported. And so is there a vision there, a vision for what the university is and what it represents, that is really anathema to being a truly Christian university? Can a truly Christian university have those kinds of business and military entanglements that resulted in the physical plant we have today at the university? And that's a question that we sort of begged last time. It's a question that I think is probably been pretty much forgotten by now.
But that was the moment. That was the moment when it was decided that's not going to be open to discussion. We're going down this road.
And when it comes to the CIA and American policy in those years that the CIA represented and was central to, Notre Dame actually has a couple of important counterexamples. Philip Agee, who wrote the first expose about what the CIA was doing, was a Notre Dame graduate, class of 57, I think.
Something like that, yeah.
Ralph McGehee, who was also in the CIA, recruited from Notre Dame, was an important source for the exposure of what the CIA had done in those pre-Vietnam and Vietnam years. I had the pleasure, and it was a pleasure, of talking to both of these men when they returned to Notre Dame for a reunion. Agee was still being hunted by the American government at the time, so his attendance at the reunion was interesting in itself, and a number of his contemporaries commented on it. But the information was there. We don't realize sometimes how powerful the system of forming political opinion in this country really is, and how much the evidence, the witness of these people from the belly of the beast, that is the CIA, who talked about their connections with the CIA and how it all began at Notre Dame and the importance of Notre Dame in those connections, how that gets ignored. It's not an accident. It's a conscious, carefully comprised program. And the only way to counter it is to tell the real story. That's what Agee and McGee did. And you've seen the efforts that are taken to make sure that the stories aren't told.
Yeah, I don't think we could walk around campus and find any brass plaques on a building that talk about Philip Agee or Ralph McGahee, or the countless unnamed, unheralded, conscientious objectors who were Notre Dame graduates, whether it was in World War I, or World War II, or the Korean War, or Vietnam. There was, I don't know if anybody's ever counted them up or even tried to find out how many students, when there was an active draft, became conscientious objectors. But I imagine there's quite a number, and let alone those who count themselves as committed pacifists, who work in very active social activism, peace activism, if you will, and became prominent in one way or another, leaders in the Catholic tradition in terms of war resistance and the peace movement. there's no memorials at Notre Dame for these things. There's no written publications that that the university has sponsored that promote that part of Notre Dame's history. It could be an important part of history, and ones that current students could learn quite a bit, and would lead those students to maybe other questions and other forms of dialogue than the predominant ethos or mythic of Notre Dame as it's presented in public relations and fundraising and promotional materials and videos and books and so forth. There's other stories to be told, and those are two good examples of Notre Dame grads who did go to work for an organization like the CIA, and maybe because of their Catholic background or Christian values, came to see it for what it really was.
As a matter of fact, let's see, 2019, so on about 2011, 12, in around there, a number of graduates in Notre Dame came together in a little group called PeaceNet, Notre Dame PeaceNet. And the idea was to try to promote specifically nonviolence and the et cetera, on campus. But one of the things they agreed upon to do was to ask Ted Hesburgh, who was the emeritus president of the university, to ask Ted Hesburgh to support a placing of some kind of memorial on campus for those Notre Dame graduates who are conscientious objectors, resistors to war. And we found them to go back to the Second World War, and quite a few in terms of the Vietnam War. Well, anyway, a person went from the group to Ted Hesburgh to ask that. And he presented the proposal to Ted, and he said, Ted Hesburgh's immediate response was, I will not support that project. Now, I think what's interesting is Ted Hesburgh supported individual conscientious objectors. On several occasions, people who were conscientious objectors and asked for his support received it and received the status, even people in the military who asked. But when the presentation was made to him, you've got a gigantic Herculean, the gargantuan Veterans Memorial on campus, taking up the whole space of the field house, what was there, and in honor of veterans, people who went forward and were willingly killed in war. And so now, why not have a little memorial for those people that were graduates of Notre Dame and who rejected killing as a way of doing God's will, who followed the nonviolent Jesus of the gospel. Why not just have that as a public something that's there, because it not only represents a piece of Notre Dame's history, it represents the oldest and still valid moral tradition of the Catholic Church. If you will, the pacifist tradition. Just for technical point, there's not one sentence in the first 300 years of Christianity, not a sentence justifying a Christian going to war in 300 years closest to Jesus. Now, the reason I mention that is, this is not just about the university. Notre Dame gets its raison d'etre from being tied to Jesus. And it is doing wonderful things in terms of that. Wonderful things. In terms of its social service activities, in terms of the liturgy, and all kinds of wonderful things. But in terms of CIA and DOW back at this time, it was obstinately refusing to even acknowledge the teachings of Jesus were pertinent in this area. Basically, it was saying, I will not serve.
So why do we come back? And we've been back several times now. So why are we doing this? You know, it's I've been asked that question. It's not for nostalgia, but there is a point to. We think we have a stake in hoping that people in the university will, and who are here now and the ongoing in the future will be in the business of evaluating the university's entanglements with the military, with the business world, with government, covert government organizations, and this sense of this idea that somehow Christianity and patriotism combine to mean Christians, that we revere the military service, and without any real thorough examination of how that can be squared with the teachings of the gospel. And, I don't know whether, you never know whether there's going to be impact of that. I don't think we were really influenced by anybody we knew before us when we were acting. We just did what we thought was the right time at the moment. And I bumped into Notre Dame students that were just fascinated by the fact that there ever was activism at Notre Dame. And the things that we hear of students getting excited about or getting very upset about and activistic about are, I wouldn't say they're trivial, they're real sentiments, but they're somewhat ephemeral and somewhat short-lived, and none of them go to the heart of how Notre Dame fulfills its role as being a Catholic university. So I know that's sort of what I hope to accomplish somewhat by being here. Plus, it's terrific seeing my friends who we have this bond because of this, and it's nice to revisit that.
Well, as Carl mentioned in his 40th anniversary talk, I forget who he quoted, but approximately he said, one of the problems with history is that it doesn't stop. It's not ended. It doesn't stop because you say such and such is over. It just keeps going. The actual reality keeps playing out in actual lived lives, and so.
I think that was Faulkner's line: "The past isn't over. The
Yeah,
past
there you
isn't bad. The past isn't really past. It's not even
Beautiful.
over."
Yeah. Past isn't past. It really isn't even over.
I'm putting that badly too, but it's
Yeah.
close to that.
That's it. Because what went on November 18th, 1969, is going on November 18th, 2019. Right now, right here at Notre Dame. Except it's going on in spades, not just. And by the way, just to make a point, the Catholic tradition, Catholic moral tradition, the presumption in the Catholic moral. Now, I don't know what they do in terms of teaching just war theory to the people who are going out to kill, maybe ROTC people, or in terms of the people that they are bringing in here to recruit. But I've written a book on it, so that's why I know a little bit about it. The presumption of the Catholic moral tradition is pacifism, peace, not violence. That comes from Jesus. The just war tradition is an exception to the presumptive stance, which is the teaching of Jesus. It's an exception that's made only if certain categories are met, and the Catechism says, and met strictly. The Vietnam War, what DOW was doing, what CIA was doing, in no way, shape, or form, not only did not meet any standards of the gospel, they didn't even come close to meeting any standards of the Catholic just war theory. And mind you, if you go to war and you don't meet those standards, then the killing that you're doing is unjust, and unjustified killing is murder, the same as abortion. I don't see anyone in the Catholic Church denying communion to people who are going over there and murdering people in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. The point being, if they're not murdering people, then somehow they must be meeting the standards of the Catholic just war theory strictly. And there's no war, at least I know in my time, that has ever done that, or is doing it, as a matter of fact. So, this is not just an issue of Notre Dame. This is an issue of Notre Dame giving false moral witness to the world because it is such a mega media institution. the witness that all you have to do is join the military and you can hand your conscience over to it as a Catholic. You cannot do that. That's not the church's teaching.
And
The church's teaching is you must disobey immoral orders. Period. In the catechism.
And the corollary kind of falsehood, Charlie, that I think is often promoted, and you still hear it today, is that by having Notre Dame students go through ROTC, work in the military, or work for military industrial complex corporations, it will somehow Christianize those organizations. We're better off as a country and better off as a society by having Notre Dame men and women in those organizations, because they'll make them better, more moral places than if we got rid of ROTC and so forth and didn't have that Christianizing influence. It's almost and as far as I know, I'm a researcher. I don't know of any evidence to this. I don't know anybody that's ever presented evidence that the drone operator in Arizona or Virginia, with the supervisor and captain standing behind them and say, aim that drone at that little village in Afghanistan, that a Christianized operator is going to say, well, I'm sorry, does this meet just war theory? Because I think there's civilians there. And I think civilians are undoubtedly going to be killed in that little village that you're hunting for that one Al-Qaeda guy, but there's 15 civilians around them. I don't know any data to suggest that happens.
The Catholic chaplaincy in the military is forbidden to teach the just war publicly. They can talk about it if someone comes to them for private counseling. But Catholic military chaplains, according to military regulations, cannot publicly, when recruits come in, cannot publicly communicate to them the standards of the just war theory.
Answer but don't tell.
So it's kind of, don't ask, don't tell. But the point is, of course, the reason that that's there is because no war is fought today according to the Catholic just war theory. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows that. It's a phony theory. It's the logic of deceit. It can't be met. But the point being, these fellows are going out of here from Notre Dame, and I don't know what they got for a just war theory, what's in their minds and how it's taught to them and so forth and so on. But what I do know is there's not a speck of research, just like there is not a speck of research that Christians in the military in any way Christianize the military. If anything, it's the other way around. Christians are militarized into the values of the military, starting in boot camp. They have to leave go of their Christianity to go and stick a dagger in a dummy that's a make-believe human being. I've got military, because I've taught this stuff, I've got military training programs, videos of DIs in the Marine Corps telling the recruits, what I want you to do is, I want you to go back and I want you to yell, yeah, that sort of business, because we're going to send this guy, Vietnam in this particular case, we're going to send this guy home to his mommy in a doggy bag. And they're all yelling, yeah. There's an unrealism about what's going on here and what the military is and what it's said to be in myth and what's going on here at Notre Dame in terms of it. But the point is, it's kept here at Notre Dame because it brings in huge amounts of money to the university over its entire history. We've got photos. Notre Dame publishes photos of people learning how to kill people in the First World War on the campus with the log chapel in back of them. And we all know what the First World War was. It was just a bloodbath. Had nothing to do with justice, anything else. The only thing is here that we're talking about is something is awfully, awfully wrong at Notre Dame. And in 1969, on November 18th, it was raised up for people to see for a moment. And the university crushed it down, and it took the road most traveled, not the road least traveled.
I think that about wraps up for us today.
Yeah, we'll need to wrap it up because there's We have other events coming up.
Yeah.
Well, you,
Yes,
yes,
sir.
please, yes, Richard.
Is
Yes,
it
you do.
appropriate to ask you guys a question?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Of course, we're
Especially-
taking questions.
Especially from you,
And
Bill.
I came in late, so if you addressed it already,
It's on there.
yeah. But I'd be interested from each or any of you.
This is,
how-
by the way, Bill Mitchell from the National Catholic Reporter.
How this event shaped your life in quite practical, concrete terms. What difference did it make?
Well, I mean, I think for me, there were practical consequences. I didn't get to go to I wanted to go to Chicago for law school, and I know for certain I didn't get in there because of this. But I think also it was the idea that I always felt that it was important that I adhered to what I believed, and that as crazy it sort of seems, and I think for parents, have your son who's just a junior in college to make a decision that really could be disastrous for their career. I mean, if we don't, who knows why they would have let us all back in? You know, they may not have, and my life would have been even more different, I suppose. But I think the real thing is thinking about, well, why? How does any university, get away with putting students in that position, who are only bring to a moral point? So I think that for me, I would say that in my legal career, I got used to the idea of sticking my neck out a little bit. I think that some of the things I've accomplished that are things that I have achieved as a lawyer and still am achieving, it really had a lot to do with going a little bit over the top, going beyond myself, sticking my neck out in ways that, with the extent that I can do that without hurting my client, but put my own self forward. In a lot of my work is really morally persuading prosecutors, and so having the idea that it's okay to take on that role, even if you think about the legal world. So I think it was sort of, I wouldn't say it was training, but I think, I would say I don't think events affect us as much as I think that we bring ourselves to the event, and the event becomes us. We are there. There's no accident that the three of us were there because of our values and attitudes and our beliefs. Not only led us there, even though we didn't plan the result, led us there and made us stay. And so the event really was us. It wasn't so much the event affected us, it really represented who we were. And whenever we are true to ourselves, that's always going to affect the path you take in the future.
Chris, yeah.
I don't think about that, Bill. One thing, it kind of, with what Mark said, it kind of showed me that I had the courage to take a stand on something important, and allowed me to proceed through the rest of my life to take maybe smaller, less noticeable stands on important matters, and regardless of the consequences. I don't know that it impacted my life negatively. I was one of the ones who came and then left. I was readmitted and then left. But I'm grateful that my life has turned out the way it has. I've been extremely blessed, and I believe I have a well-developed Catholic Christian conscience, and that began here at this university. Despite what I expected when I came here, to be a success, to get wealthy and things like that, it changed here.
I had just begun teaching at Notre Dame when this event occurred, and I found to not much surprise that my teaching contract was not renewed after the 2 years that I was after the years that I was here. I came in '69, left in '71. I left not by choice, and that has made some difference, I'm sure, to me and my family. As I left town day before yesterday to drive here, I stopped by my eldest son's house. He was born in 1965, and so was a small kid when we were here. I said to him, we're going off to Notre Dame, where you might have grown up. And he looked at me and said, "Dad, I did grow up in Notre Dame." And I think, he meant that there was enough influence from that time that he found important.
Yeah.
I think he's right.
Well, I think one of the lessons I learned as a student is, as students, we tend to get so wrapped up in classes and grades and so forth. That's our little worlds, and it certainly was mine to start out at Notre Dame as a pre-med major, and then I ended up as a psych major. What I learned outside the classroom, I found to be equally valuable, including everything around this incident and the people involved in this incident. That was an important part of my learning, and I carried that into my own teaching as a professor at Cornell and encouraging students. And I know a lot of students get involved with activities and issues outside the classroom, or get involved with the local community, or get involved with international issues, or what have you. And students come to that in lots of different ways, but this was an incident at that time where a lot of learning took place and a lot of skill development took place in terms of just, we had to work together as a group. We had to, negotiate some very tricky waters in terms of as 19-year-olds and 20-year-olds. So it was a learning experience, and I think that was a positive thing. In terms of my own substantive work as a researcher, I did focus on issues of violence, and particularly with children, around children, child abuse and neglect. Some work that Mark has been involved with legally and so forth. Family violence has become a topic that I've done some work with. So I've kept a thread of concerns about violence and the impact of violence on children and families, sort of in those close-in units, as well as concern with broader societal violence and so forth. But so much violence gets played out in the family unit and in these small circles as well. So I think that had an impact on my sort of substantive work later on.
You shut me down when you need to.
Well, let me just follow with Charlie for a
Oh,
second. Yeah. So Charlie, when I first met you, you wore a three-piece suit. You had a bag full of graduate degrees, including a degree from Notre Dame, and you were a teacher who I would say you inspired so many people, and yet you never fostered any kind of cultish following, but you made a difference in a lot of people's lives. And then when this all happened, and you announced, and it's actually in our materials that are available online, you announced that you were going to not seek to continue at the university when your contract was up. And that was in part, I know you say it's in part protest. I don't know if it was in part that you just want to get the heck out of here. And so you went off, and so you were, and now you are a priest, and you were married. You had a bunch of kids. We probably don't have enough time to talk about what all happened to you or with you afterward. You're, for me, the same person you always were, but you're in a different iteration of yourself as a priest, and you've got a ministry, and you've been probably the leading scholar really for Christian nonviolence in terms of your lecturing around the country, your association with the Martin Luther King family and the study of nonviolence, and which was very predictable no matter whether you were a priest or not. But is there anything quickly you can tell us about how this affected you?
Well, as you know, I was involved all aspects of it, except the actual event. So I didn't. It seemed to me that the. It seemed to me, I'll use the word because I'm going to use it tonight too. It seemed to me that what the university did That is not just in throwing you guys out, but what it did in supporting DOW, CIA, and all that business there at that time, with the situation had become crystallized, clarified. It seemed to me, and still does seem to me, as nothing short of wicked. When you think of the pain and the suffering that Dow and the CIA have brought upon, and that this was being religiously legitimatized by this institution of the Catholic Church, major public relations institute of the Catholic Church. So I thought about what happened over maybe 10 days after you got the decision. And I decided, who's right here? Who do you stand with? Do you stand with the excommunicators, or do you stand with the excommunicated? So I asked myself, what do the excommunicators have that I want? And the answer was money, my job. But it was more than that. It was that teaching was my profession. I love teaching. I'm a lawyer, but I love teaching. Teaching was what I could do well, right? And I love to do it, both philosophy, theology, and in nonviolence. We, as I told some people earlier tonight, when I started that program, we had 2 classes, Jim Douglas and I, and by the time I left, we had 20 classes, interdisciplinary classes, and 500 people registered for it when Maury Amons took over. The loss of the teaching of nonviolence in any sort of ongoing systematic way was a great loss. But also, we had just bought a farm out in Granger and had 3 children and just had to walk away from that, of course. So there were those kinds of difficult human changes that occurred because of this. But it was absolutely clear. The university was standing publicly when they stood with the CIA and Dow, and that's what it was. And just against the student, they were standing with wickedness. It reminded me of what was done to the students. What it was in my mind, because there's a major consciousness at that time, is after the Berrigans burned the draft files at Catonsville in 1968, they stood around and waited for the police. They had napalmed the draft files from the and they stood and they handed out a statement is what they did. And basically the statement said, in their words, was, how dare you people, meaning the police and the government that police represent, how dare you people arrest us for napalming paper when you're napalming human beings 7,000 miles away? And that's the same thing here. How dare these students be thrown out while you're supporting people who are napalming or killing 7,000 miles away in a war? Now get this. In a war that in 1966, Thomas Merton, in a monastery, called an overwhelming atrocity. Before the Berrigans, in 1968, Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen condemned the war publicly in a letter to President Johnson and said it's your duty to get out of there immediately, not even to try to repair the damage. By 1969, we were fully conscious of what was going on. Notre Dame, now, stop, this is important. The 50th anniversary, the 40th anniversary last year, we all had Mass with Ted Hesburgh. Ted Hesburgh and I and the whole group can celebrate it. And there was no animosity, no anger, no hate, just real camaraderie. But there was no backing down from what went on. Ted said to me after the Mass, and she said, well, probably we've all grown a little since that time, All right, we'll let it go at that. But there was never any animosity between Ted Hesburgh and myself. And what there was a passionate distaste for his standing with wickedness in 1969. Parenthetically, several years later, I was involved with a case of trying to get the longest standing person on death row in Georgia, a black man, off from capital punishment, a fellow by the name of Billy Neal Moore. And we were in the last month of trying to get him out, and I wrote a letter to it was in the Atlantic Monthly and so forth. Anyway, I called Ted, and I told him what the story was with Billy Neal Moore, and that this was a human being that no one wanted to kill, not even the governor. But the thing was set up for, the governor didn't pardon in Georgia, it was the Board of Parolees. But anyway, Board of Trustees. But anyway, I said, could you give Billy Neal Moore some help in trying to get him off this execution route that no one wants to do, because he's such a good person now, after 18 years in prison, on death row. And Ted immediately said yes. He said, I'll tell you what, he said, I'll call Jimmy and Rosalind, see what they can do. Cotter. Now, I found out years later from a friend of mine who knew Jimmy Carter's kind of like travel secretary, John Eckenrode's cousin, Fran Vorty. And who now deceased, Lord have mercy on her, but I found out from a friend of hers that Jimmy Carter almost adored Ted Hesburgh. He liked him so much. That's fine. He called Jimmy Carter and he asked Jimmy Carter to write something to the Atlantic Monthly or something to the Board of Pardons to release Billy Neal Moore from death row. Jimmy Carter said no. No, he wouldn't. Rosalind, on the other hand, wrote an article for the Atlantic Monthly in favor of getting him out, stopping the execution. But he did that. This is not a case of what was going on at Columbia or Berkeley. This is Notre Dame, and it was altogether different. The animosity, the hate, it just wasn't there. But what was there was a very keen sense that something was terribly wrong with supporting Dow and CIA in 1969 and the other stuff. So,
And something terribly threatening to the survival of his image of the university.
That's right. And so so life went on for me after that, and I went back and I was different things, and it totally changed life. And the big thing it took away from life was teaching. That was because teaching, I loved to do at the time, all kinds of things, and certainly teaching the nonviolence. And so, yes, I've done a lot of that in terms of going all over the world teaching gospel nonviolence at seminars and blah, 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 but never again in a university atmosphere. And interestingly enough, every time I would talk to a university around Boston about putting a course in nonviolence, just as an adjunct or something, I almost never got a response back, because once they wrote here, that was the end of it. But be that as it may, do I wish it hadn't happened? Do I wish it hadn't happened? And my answer is that I could have enjoyed a life here teaching philosophy or humanities, or certainly gospel nonviolence, and could have built that program into something that is utterly different than what the Kroc Center is today. But be that as it may, there's a phrase that from Jean-Pierre Coussard's Abandonment to Divine Providence, that God arranges the accomplishment of his highest designs by means that often deeply offend our normal feelings. And what I can be sure of is, I had not the slightest doubt at the moment that I was doing the thing I was supposed to do as a baptized Christian, and standing with the executed versus the executors of this.
It's a good place to end.
Yeah. Bill, you had another question, though.
If there's time, I'm wondering if any of you are consider taking acts of civil disobedience these days on issues like climate change, like nuclear weapons. It's been interesting. Catholics in their 60s and 70s, in a variety of circumstances, are engaging in civil disobedience. What's your perspective on that these days, personally?
I got the personal out. Instead of being a protester, I represented many protesters. So artists, nuclear freeze, civil rights, and I've had the pleasure of having the skill to be able to make their case. And I think the other thing that makes the difference too is that I always very convinced of the need for that defense to be a personal expression of their values and beliefs, and not be a legalistic, technical kind of defense. And that's been very gratifying for me. It's been an area I've done a lot of back home in Buffalo.
And Mark was twice selected Criminal Defense Lawyer of the Year, honored by the New York Bar Association. This guy, I mean, he's got it. You know, if he defends you, you're being defended.
Where were you back then when we needed?
Yeah, where
I
were you?
tried. I read half of the thing. I tried. You know, we chose the moral route.
That's right.
They were stuck with junior faculty members
We
when they
have to
needed
deal
a
with
vote.
that.
Yeah, right.
So
Well,
anybody else? Any other?
Yeah, you know something on that, I'll tell you. In terms of demonstrations today, that sort of business. First of all, I am at great odds with a large part of the peace movement right from the time of the Vietnam War. And I think I was validated in the last years of Phil Berrigan's life. My problem after I was up at Grant Park in Chicago, August 27th to 28th at the Democratic National Convention of 68,
Yeah.
was that I watched the Abby Hoffmans and the Jerry Rubins and so forth and all that world. There was nothing of goodness in it. There was protest, but I didn't see any goodness. I saw viciousness, I saw hate, I saw other things, but I didn't see goodness. And I walked away from that after 2 days and said, there's no salvation in that. There's no change in that. These people are mirror images on the left, what's going on the right. Anyway, so we did do some demonstrations, as you know, because you were here at Notre Dame after that, Mark, and so on and so on. But those were controlled by the people who were Christian and were putting them together like that. The key is what? The key was the gospel is very clear. You saved the whale without love, and you've done nothing. Love is the key to whether a demonstration. What love? Christ-like love. Three things last: faith, hope, and love. 1 Corinthians 13. If I have all the eloquence of men and angels, speak without love. All right. The love that's being talked about is Christ-like love, and that's a love that struggles to be devoid of enmity or hate or anger, or not anger, but viciousness, but full of passion for truth. Right? So, I walked away from that sort of thing, and during the Vietnam War, and Phil Berrigan at the end of his life, when asked about his early demonstrations, said, "No, there was not enough love in them." Yes, you get to it. Okay. So where are we now with demonstrations? Well, Catholics demonstrating, et cetera, et cetera. Let me put it this way. The Catholic Church, Notre Dame included, but the Catholic Church exists today in the United States within the domain of the Catholic episcopacy in the United States, who control the money, who control the pulpit, who control teaching ultimately. They control the consciousness input that goes into the Catholic world. The Catholic bishops of the United States, I call them, have been a Kitty Genovese group for the last 20 years. No Kitty Genovese? Mm-hmm. Bystanders. Not a word out of them. One bishop back in 2003, Bishop John Michael Botein, the Romanian bishop of the United States and Canada, issued a statement saying this war in Iraq is immoral. This meets no standard of the gospel or just war theories. He was right, of course. Not a word out of the Catholic bishops in terms of all the killing that's been done since 2003. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, on and on. Not just there, but in all kinds, Africa, it's going on all the time. Dead silence. Dead silence. Now, I'm all for saving the whale, as long as it's being done with Christ-like love and not hate and so forth and so on. But I honestly believe that there is a way that human beings are called to prioritize the use of their life's time. And between saving the whale and human beings, men, women, and children, being blown apart by the American military overseas and the American government here ordering it, I think there's a, in my mind, there should be a clear discernment that saving the whale is quite secondary. And so, I'm really looking for the demonstration. I'm really looking for the demonstrations that are out there saying, stop the perpetual war. It's evil. It's wrong. Not just it's impolitical or unpolite but it's almost, as we've reached the point now, the Kitty Genovese episcopacy just sits by and spends their time on all kinds of saving the whale projects. So I don't see how much can be done in the Catholic Church if that's how they're going to be, and that is how they're going to be. They're not going to change now. And remember, the United States Catholic Episcopacy is in the same position to the military as Notre Dame. Every time they meet in Baltimore over the years, I've been there. Every time they meet on Tuesday night, the military gives them a banquet. The military gives the bishops a banquet on Tuesday night, and they all attend, and they bring in all kinds of. It's the banquet. Therefore, the relationships with the elites of the church and the elites of the military and so forth and so on, the money that's involved, and of course the possibilities which the New York Times and corporate media has shown. If the media wants, it can tear apart the church. Wait till if you think the sex scandal is big stuff, the child abuse, imagine if it ever gets into how the church has been using money all these years, all these decades, centuries, and the tax code and so forth. No. They're not going to say a word. How can 300 highly intelligent, trained men, street smart, not say a word in 15 years of bombing and napalming and killing and so forth? Millions of people in a country 7,000 miles away. It's a Genovese, a Kitty Genovese episcopacy at this moment in time, and therefore there are no demonstrations that I think take priority over the slaughtering of people to the tune of 1 million by the United States military.
On demonstrations, there may be an aspect of this, one of the very few places where I actually disagree with Charlie. I knew the late Abbie Hoffman slightly and admired him, and admired what he did, even though he was a very peculiar character in a lot of ways. There are too many places in the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament where it's suggested at least that God accomplishes his ends or her ends with flawed instruments. And it seems to me that many of the people that we're talking about here, including the late Brother Hoffman, was a flawed instrument, but a necessary one. And I think Charlie and I may evaluate these things slightly differently, but it's not because we differ fundamentally, but we're talking about tactics, and that's what Abbie was doing.
But we don't disagree. We absolutely, positively,
I don't think we do.
We don't disagree that God works through flawed instruments.
Right.
I think maybe, just maybe, we disagree at the point that you can't choose to be a part of the flawed instrument.
Oh,
It's a
exactly,
good moral
yes.
choice, right? So
It's
that's
not, it's not a job description.
right.
I'd be
Who wants to
interested
go
in
after?
others' takes on Charlie's characterization of the climate crisis, which seems to kind of
Secondary.
diminish things by simply saving the whales. Isn't that a more consequential situation than that?
Well, I see it as more existential than that, and in the sense that I think we can draw lots of lines between what's going on in the environmental crisis with the violence that we see in
Surely
the
can.
world. And we're going to see more of it as populations have to migrate and compete for space in the remaining habitable parts of the planet. So I think these are inextricably linked, as well as with imperialistic and economic injustice issues, racial injustice issues. I think these are connected, these connective tissue, if you will, and you do need to get to the heart of the matter, and in order to address those. So I would say that what we've been talking about today, we were somewhat interested in environmental issues then. We were certainly interested in DOW and Agent Orange as an important. I think we probably saw it more from the people perspective than the destruction of the environment and what that would do for generations to come. But that information has come forward subsequent to our actions. But I think we're now in a more high relief in terms of thinking of these connections between what's going on environmentally and the kind of unregulated kind of vulture capitalism system that we live under, and how that's contributed to climate change and to violence, because violence becomes in the military become a last resort for holding the line against the hordes that are going to be invading your country, or however you see that playing out. So I think students now are much more aware than we were, perhaps, because of the press of the issue.
But are they here? The question is, though, so this is, we talked about the fork, a choice of Christian versus the military and the corporations and the money. Are students now making the connection between the choices that are being made that roll up into victimization in terms of climate change of the whole world, and how's the money flow? Why are the moneyed interests there such that we have abandoned the Amazon, that we've left the third world and developing nations, where this is where the ground zero for climate change, that we've basically let that go? And so the choices have been made, I think, motivated by the same things, by the greed on the one hand, and by disregard of victims on the other, and very short-sightedness.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a huge connection between them, which is a huge challenge for activism today.
Well, we probably have to wrap up, because
Yeah,
we
have to
have there's a 4:30 mass that Charlie's going to be celebrating.
Is it possible to make just one quick comment?
Correct.
Archimedes.
No.
Yeah, no, there's no such thing as that. Archimedes said, show me the point outside the world with a fulcrum, and I can move the whole world. Show me a point outside the world, exactly point, and with a fulcrum, I can move the whole world. The fulcrum for change is Christ-like love, and anything without that is devoid of the power and wisdom necessary to move the world into something better. It's just the wheel spinning.
It's the message of Revelation.
Fini.
Amen.
Thank you.